Some good experiences that people highlighted were when they had a contact, because often, right, these groups are ones that might report abuse as well, because they see it. So they, Rise Up, for example, which is an email service provider based in the U.S., many activists use it. You don't have to provide any information to get an email account. So of course you also have bad actors. They can see abuse on their servers, people signing up for 50 email accounts and so on, and they want to be able to report that to assert. And you get other cases like this where it's useful to have contact with these organizations because they can also then report abuse. Back to what I was saying, which is the good examples have been where the organizations have a contact at Assert, and they work closely together, and they're responsive, and I think those kinds of relationships are what we need more of, and it's difficult to know exactly how to mechanize it, but I think some people have talked about some solutions, and I'm interested also from the audience about what they see and their experiences with this. So I'll stop there, and looking forward to the discussion.
Awesome. Thanks, Mallory. So the first question I'd like to pose to the panel is on what benefit does a network like FIRST provide to the CSIRTs, and particularly given that there's a kind of absence of civil society in the CERT and the network space. What value is there to those CSIRTs joining, and what would you be interested in from those civil society CSIRTs? So Kristen, if you could start us off.
So, talking a little bit about the first, it's always that happens. So, is the value is really joining the community. So. One of the points that I'm even linking with your example, it's because in instant handling, in instant response, the key are the people that are there. It's not tools. So the key of FIRST is really getting people together to know each other, to become friends. And it's a very interesting community because usually you go to the conference to meet friends and to gain trust with them and then start projects. There is nothing magical. It's not like a platform that will do something, but actually enables people to do a lot of work during the whole year. And this is how standards come about. This is how new tools are created. So, and it's very informal. And this is one of the keys. Like all the cooperation happen among CSIRTs is not based on treaties or signing papers or defining anything. It's really trust among people, trust that those people are knowledgeable, they have expertise, and trust that they will not break confidence, trust that they will know how to handle information. But the point that I would like to make with what Mallory said is that really it's very hard to find experts to work with instant handling. There's a shortage. We don't have like a lot of people to do instant handling. And all certs are flooded with too much information, too many data. And then you have automation fails like this one, that you trust someone that received data from someone else that probably received from someone else. And probably you did that person, you don't have a person to manually go through everything. And for example, the discussion about where is too much automation is a discussion that we at CERT-PR brought to the FIRST community several times in some meetings, saying that we're kind of automating too much. And most of the teams say, yeah, but I cannot have people to go through that information. So I think this is one of the challenges when we're doing instant handling, is really to recognize that false positives will happen, that you have errors. And one of the things that I think the community is missing is good feedbacks for reporting these problems back. So probably that blocking happened because nobody had the time and nobody looked and they trusted information coming. So it's that a kind of thing that we discuss a lot when we talk about information sharing. It's really what are you going to do with that? And problems will happen. And we have a lot of not-for-profit organizations that are responsible for providing that information that also don't have the means to have a person looking at it. So it's interesting because it's too much information. You need to automate, but really the tools are not there yet. So it doesn't matter how much hype you have about machine learning and artificial intelligence, it's not like that. You cannot have like a magic tool to do it. You need people, knowledgeable people. And most of the certs, they will be like 5, 10 people. You know, you don't have certs like with hundreds. So I would love to see more civil society participation. One good thing would be for people to go to the conferences, to go there, to meet certs, to understand a little bit, and to meet people really in the breaks and to know other people. And I think this is one of the benefits of joining FIRST, is really to get into that community. And it is an inviting community. It's not really something that people are you need to be afraid of. So it's kind of, I think, just show up. And we also have TCs and colloquiums happening. For example, in Latin America, we have that together with LACNIC. So we always invite people to join. There are a lot of ones in Europe, in Asia. Africa has started to have local events. So I think all the community could start joining their local teams. And I think that is the major value. It's really, because inside FIRST, although we are all seen in the IGF context as the technical community, but really we have teams from government, teams from academia, from not-for-profit. So it's a mix of people that also learn to understand each other. So I hope that I replied a little bit to the question.
Great, thank you. Would anyone else like to contribute on that topic? Okay, sure.
The added value of C-Search, in my opinion, is very big. Basically, it allows the creation of a web of trust among those users, and this is quite crucial. A security incident, if arrives very quickly to the relevant people and is coming from a trustworthy source, can make the difference between something that is very easy to mitigate if information arrives very quickly, or if arrives late or never arrives, can have a major impact. Also, the role of sectoral C-certs. That's something that in the beginning some sectors were not understanding. For example, the banking sector, as I mentioned before, they were a bit reluctant in the beginning to cooperate. But then, because they are competing in the market for customers, so why cooperate? But then they understood that in the specific case of security, the reputation of banks is very critical for the increase of the user base, not only in terms of people, but also in services. If there is a major problem with a single bank about data leak of an application or some other technical problem, that harms all the sector. So this cooperation is considered by them very critical.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to drill down a bit more into this issue of trust. So we heard from Christine that it's individuals getting in a room and getting to know each other that builds that trust. But I do think there are certain circumstances that make trust a particularly difficult exercise between civil society and particularly governments. Because, you know, for a lot of civil society organisations and activists and human rights defenders on the ground, you know, their greatest adversary is often the government of the country where they're operating from. So I'd like to have people dig into this issue of trust a bit more and see if we can't work out some ways for us better to build trust. think, Mallory, you once said before that, this mixing of information security with national security is something that erodes trust amongst us. And so, yeah, if we could address issues like that, I'd be very happy.
Yes, I think that is actually true, that there is some issue with that. And I think one of the things too, and this maybe speaks to a bit what Christine's talking about with the FIRST community, is that imagine you find pockets, right? You find pockets of people who work together well, who trust each other, and that's not necessarily the whole community, but you have that opportunity to create those alliances. And I think that may be exactly the benefit of having more civil society. Not necessarily civil society certs, but like going back to my example, you need civil society aware certs. So just certs and teams that are trusted, they understand the issues, they maybe are collaborative and there are projects between different groups. I think that would be very, very valuable. And because I do think, like also Christine said, there is a lack of expertise. So starting up a new cert, maybe not something that a sort of low capacity organization could really take on. There's a lot, as Access Now knows, it takes a lot to ramp up a big project like this, and you're just now becoming first members. So can civil society really take on that role? But maybe what it is, it's more partnering, it's more working together, finding projects and opportunities to become close to one another, so that certs just understand what are the needs of civil society, and what are the potential issues that come up, or when a new issue comes up, there are open channels of communication to solve the problem.
So I would like to add a little bit on that, because in the past few years we have seen more and more moves of having national certs as government certs. And what we are seeing in the national certs community, because in FIRST you also have, as we call the pockets, but you have, there are special interest groups for the industry, like vendors, as Audrey said. They are very worried about product security, about how to communicate new vulnerabilities. So they have a special interest group. They work together. So national teams, we also have a special interest group, because usually we're not talking about the security of my network. I'm talking about the security of someone else. So there are different challenges in that. And what we are seeing is that every time certs are moving more into some parts of some governments, they just either don't even show up in the meetings anymore, they don't talk anymore, and the cooperation is eroding. So I think one of the points that is very interesting to see is that as they become more government-centric and especially very focused on national infrastructure, they are not cooperating anymore. And I would like to quote Marina. She just entered the room, so it's a good time, because I was in her session this morning, and I think a phrase that she said was very important, because she opened the session of the NRI collaborative session saying that this is the first time in the history that the governments can provide security without cooperation. And I think a lot of governments are failing to realize that they cannot provide security for their countries. They need, I can provide security for my network. A citizen can provide security for himself. A university needs to do a security. You cannot have someone else providing security. And the only way that you can help in security is through cooperation. So this is something that we are seeing to happen. So one of the things is governments are worried, they are preoccupied, but there is a mix about what is national security, what is intelligence, what is cyber war, and what is internet security. And they are not the same thing. And although they look like, because you can go, some information that certs have could be seen as intelligence information or as information for something else, if you start treating everything as something that's classified, you are not going to be able to provide security. So I think from all this move and this shift, it comes a lot of this, I think, issues that civil society has a problem in trusting these certs because it's confusing. So if I have a national team that is below an intelligence agency, who am I talking to? So if I have a national team that's part of the federal police of the country, who I'm talking to the police or to a cert? So I think that what needs to be clear is that there is no right or wrong, but all governments need to understand what are the consequences of the choices that they are making and what can happen, that where you put your national team will make a tremendous difference on how well it cooperates, how it can talk to different stakeholders. And one of the things, for example, that we have in Brazil, like CERT-BR is more of a last resort cert. So if you don't know who you can talk to in Brazil, you can talk to us. We are going to try to find the best cert possible. And we are focused more on cyber hygiene than national security. So really is how can we improve the internet security. But we have another national team that's for the federal government network. And they have a big role in there. And we are fostering other areas to have teams that could be more focused. So there is something that needs to be discussed is there is a place for different models for everything, but depending on what you do, I think will have a direct impact on how you cooperate with other stakeholders and how you share information. So I think this is something that everyone needs to think about and to go back home and analyze like the unintended consequences of some of the policies that you implement.
Pedro, as the government representative here, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, it is something that has to be very well thought. In the specific case of Portugal, the national strategy for security in cyberspace, that's the translation of the official name of the law, try to create different dimensions. The National Cybersecurity Center runs the CSIRT, but also deals with cybersecurity as a whole. The cyber defense area is a separate area. Cyber terrorism is a different area. Cyber intelligence is a different area. We cooperate, but we try to be extremely careful in not mixing up the role of each of these dimensions. Sorry, my throat is also not prepared, was not prepared to speak. So it's something that is very crucial. We must rely on the democratic role of our societies to build significant roles among these areas, and that's a permanent fight.
Okay, thank you for that. So this whole question of, CSIRTs deal with a lot of technical work, but, coming from civil society and the human rights field, I have a question about how is human rights baked into the processes and the work that your CSIRTs do? And particularly, I'd like to start with you, Audrey. As a CSIRT for a commercial enterprise, where does human rights come into the work that you do?
Thank you. Well, it sort of starts at the top of the company where we've, recognized the UN Declaration on Human Rights, and it's a part of our corporate social responsibility, and we have policies around in line with the UN Declaration on what we think about human rights. So it's that's the foundational principle that we look at everything through. When it comes down to nitty-gritty product issues, what we're generally doing is trying to work with our technical stakeholders to find solutions to known problems. And we factor in a lot of different things when we look at that, and most of this is governed by corporate policies around how we establish product review teams and how we manage them through the process and how we engage externally with either academia or CERTs or government or some of those roles are mixed in a lot of cases, or dual-hatted, right? And so that can be kind of complicated for us, as Christine mentioned, that you sometimes have a cert that is a government but not a government, and which part of the government. And in some places it works, really great, and other places it's a little harder to figure out what the right thing to do is. But so we factor in human rights into those disclosure processes of, when we look at what the issue is, who's most likely impacted, what's the time frame, and when we need to get information out. For us, a lot of the times it's, we're fairly removed from the end user. In your case, you probably don't go flash your BIOS very often and update your firmware, right? Most people don't do that. Your OEM does that. Your original equipment manufacturer, your OEM does that for you, or a lot of people are familiar with other updating processes that platforms use. But so everyone in in the private sector ecosystem has a bit of a different role to play in bringing this forward. But we do factor in, when we're going out to our customers are often the people who make the devices. And when I say customer, I don't necessarily mean the end user. We look at who's using the particular product. We looked at, if it's a human rights group, if we know that group is particularly reliant on a feature or on a set of technologies, then we'll factor that in. And so that's all, but there's a lot of discretion in those policies too, because every issue tends to be fairly different, and the impact can be different, more severe, less severe. We do see more severe cases over time. If you just look statistically, more issues are found every year. The severity of the issues get a little bit greater. I mean, it's very hard to normalize these numbers relative to adoption of the technology. So if you could normalize for rate of adoption, it's hard to know exactly whether you'd be seeing a net aggregate increase or whether things would be kind of stable. And then there's other factors that come into how we can respond to things like open source and working with the open source community when there's issues in open source IP blocks that get integrated. But we do factor in human rights, and it comes, again, from our foundational belief in the UN Declaration on Human Rights and the idea that, which is baked into our corporate social responsibility, that trust in the use of digital technologies is a part of being able to use technology safely and securely.
Awesome, thank you. So there's one other topic that I would like to address before we go to some questions. Recently we've seen, certainly on Access Now's CSIRT, a trend towards criminalisation of technical expertise. We saw this also recently with the incarceration of some digital security trainers that went to Turkey. We see efforts to make encryption, the use of encryption, illegal. We've seen, VPNs being banned in China, and people started to be prosecuted for that. So I would just like to first, Grace, if I can throw to you and ask you about some of the particular challenges that civil society sees in relation to working with certs and with these issues.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we witnessed was during the election petition, where there were accusations that the systems, the electro systems had been hacked. And as a result of that, there is now a response that we need an ICT practitioner's bill to determine who is an ICT practitioner. So that's a response. It's a reaction to a situation that has not been thought through. So I think one of the challenges is having knee-jerk responses to situations before people can think through them and before people can look at the merits and demerits of the systems or the people working on it. Because really sometimes, like people who hack systems will tell you they're not hackers, they're just experimenting with technology. And I think that then interferes with innovation. So we are looking at that as some of the challenges, but it's a debate that's ongoing. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So what role can CSIRTs play in pushing back, against this criminalisation of technical expertise? Has anyone got a view on that?
So this topic is, I think, very hot everywhere. In Brazil, there's also some talk, especially because of crypto, and there is usually people from the legal system that they say we need to have access to contents of communication, and we have been working a lot to try to educate policymakers on the consequences of some policies that might have worked in the traditional world, and that will actually have some very bad unintended consequences in the digital world. Because I think, especially with crypto, one of the things that we say is that, okay, so you say that this company or that company, doesn't matter what is the app you use or website, needs to provide some exceptional access, or how much you want to rephrase and not say that you're putting a backdoor on crypto or something, but okay, so the criminals will just create their own message systems, and that's it. So you are not even going to have the metadata that you have. You're not going to know anything, and you be dead in the water with your investigation. So there is that much that you can push in the digital area, and people now are using the apps that everyone uses, and we will get to a point that nobody will be safe but the criminals themselves. So it's kind of something that needs to be put forward, and to have technical people in this discussion to really explain how the technology works, and to explain that, it's really not possible to protect exceptional access, because you always have the human factor. You always could have someone being, the key being stolen, someone being bribed, someone selling the information. So we need to factor all the human factors into that too. There is no way to do a perfect technology that will have both. And from the technical perspective, and from what we are discussing, it's much worse to try to protect this exceptional access than to have the information that's already there for investigation. So I think we can go to a point that it will get much, much worse, that then the governments and the legal system will have nothing of information. So I think these discussions are not really being put forward, and I don't see a lot of the technical community being brought into the discussion to really explain technically how. So it gets more a discussion of passion than a discussion of, okay, let's evaluate where will we go from now. So what could happen, and try to see really the things could get worse because people are trying to do the right thing and try to catch the criminals, but you can really provide, push them forward to do a safe haven for themselves. So I think it's really, we need to get at these stakeholders, and I think it's in these moments that's very important to think about, and to get everyone in the room, and to try to imagine what can happen if I do something. And these are some of the things that, for example, I that work for over 20 years with security, this is the first thing that I think. And some people said, oh, I never thought about that. I said, yeah, this is, I think, the nice thing of us to have these different groups in a room and to really think about it. So I think that's really bad. And I think that's really bad that you have other things that you didn't mention. For example, all the unintended consequences of some governments stockpiling zero-day vulnerabilities. So this is weakening the whole internet. So, and it's because you have oh, let's try to work with the digital space like we were working with, name it, whatever. So I think it's a point really to see and that this could be worse than really being open, and you have to realize, everyone has to realize that there is no way that you can stockpile vulnerability and at the same time protect everyone. And I think WannaCry was a good example of that. that it didn't work. So I think it's really important for us to improve cooperation, and things are difficult. And I would like to see more certs involved into providing technical expertise and sharing their view. So I think this is something that we could bring back to FIRST and try to get teams really to, share more. How do you engage policymakers, and time to speak up into that. And I would think that it would be wonderful if we could have, for example, more people from civil society submitting presentations to FIRST. For example, the case study of this blocking would be just wonderful if someone could go to the conference and present, really you were trying to do well, but actually it was not good, so how could we improve?
I just want to second what Christine said and just add a couple of additional comments on this idea of exceptional access and backdoors and weakening crypto. It's not a new discussion. Obviously, we've had it for quite some time, going on 20 years now. And but it is somewhat cyclical. We're kind of back in the middle of it. And just, I think at least one of the conversations we often have internally is the idea that if we look at the preponderance of evidence out there, the idea that anything is secret for very long, you have to be deluding yourself. And so the idea that, any kind of intentional weakening of the product or exceptional access is going to somehow maintain itself is just, it doesn't make sense in today's world. And the private sector, from a product perspective, our main issue is in protecting our customers and whatever that chain of customer is. And so we're going to be most focused on, how do we provide the best security to the end user, and that is often going to involve cryptography. And most companies, I can't say every single one, but particularly big multinationals that are serving markets all over the world, recognize that cryptography needs to be trustworthy. And we have policies in place around what cryptography we will and won't put in our products, and we're transparent about that. And so we look to the academic community in particular to help us make sure that algorithms are not, they're always vulnerable to some point, but that we're doing the right due diligence before we put new things in products. It's why there's a lot of debate about national standards versus international standards and the role of country-specific cryptography in the private sector and what we put in our products. So it's not an easy. On the other side, I want to just say that some of the concerns that particularly law enforcement have are very legitimate and real concerns. And I think for a long time, the private sector has had a position broadly that we want to be cooperative, but we want to do it within a transparent legal regime that provides us with confidence that whatever we're doing, whatever we're being asked to do, is for the right purpose and not to undermine human rights or to undermine civil liberties or to weaken somebody else's security. And the legal regimes around the world are very, very different in this regard. And so this is it's a source of tension between governments. We recognize that. And I think there's been some good discussions over the years about how to reform mutual legal assistance between countries and how to kind of ramp up our multilateral engagements to include the digital world that we live in. But it's a very slow process. And in the meantime, the technology goes much, much, much more quickly. And so I think the private sector, we're sort of left with our own principles of saying this is what we will or won't do. And, you can look out in the environment of many companies who have, taken issue with different governments over different requests that they have gotten. But I do think that you have to factor in a lot of things, and some of the things you have to factor in when you're looking at this is the legal regime that you're operating under, how transparent that government is or is not, and what the company says they're doing. And I think you won't find anyone that I can think of in the private sector that thinks that weakening the product is the way to get access, because as Christina said, it weakens it for everybody, and if we're all relying on the same stuff, it makes everything weaker. And that's why we have strong policies against doing that.
Great, thank you so much. Adil, do we have questions? No? Okay, so we'll take questions from the floor then?
Thank you. Thank you for putting that session together. It's really been informing and engaging. I'm not from the technical community, formerly civil society, now with the private sector. One of the questions that we constantly struggle with in the private sector, especially emerging countries, developing economies, is the cost versus the benefit. It's always seen when it comes to small businesses and the chains in the question, what is it that would be a good practice, a best practice, and how do you keep investing to make sure that you're performing to the optimal? We've not really seen certs putting out those standards. NIST does a good job of it, but when it comes to upgrading standards, that's one part of the conversation. My second question is to you. Speed, alercity, and relevant information is something that we seek when it comes to incident reporting, and that is the larger umbrella of this conversation. India just hosted the Asia Pacific meet of the certs. We didn't see anything at all come out in mainstream public realm or public spaces about the narratives, the conversations, the critical issues that we're addressing. So how are you putting this information? Because a repeat of an incident just means more cost for small businesses and takes business away from these countries. So is there a sharing of information where you're putting this in public domains, and what is the kind of network of networks that certs are seeing, national or private? Thank you.
Who would like to address that?
From the private sector perspective, I think the challenge from where you're sitting is, there's lots and lots of companies that are putting out lots and lots of notices all the time, and so it's an information overload, and you heard from Christine that even the certs are in information overload all the time, and without the capacity really to have human eyes on everything. So the private sector is pushing out a lot of information. There's various organizations that we participate in that try to work across a bunch of those, particularly the big vendors, to coordinate that information push so it's a little bit easier and to proliferate it through the cert system. So at least theoretically, if you're connected to a C-cert in your region, like AP cert, it would come that way. Or you could go directly to the vendor site, but then you have to know what you're looking for. And that I recognize is a big challenge. And I think it's a big challenge on our side too, is to say, are we getting enough information out there to enough of the right people? Because we can't notify 191 different countries because it's undoable. So
I would just like to add that the two questions you put, I think, are one of the most pressing issues. So there is a SIGINT first talking about metrics. So really, it's metrics of efficiency, metrics, security metrics in general. They are not good because it's very difficult to estimate the cost of an incident. So it's not just cost of people or hardware or software. So there is no good cost model. So there's a lot of discussion on that, and the speed of sharing information, it's really complicated because every organization is the only one that can filter what's relevant for them. So, and especially small and medium business, they don't have dedicated people for IT, let alone for security. So this is one big open area that needs to be discussed more on how we would tackle that. So I don't think anyone has that answer. But I think these are questions that are being discussed in several forums.
Just to add one thing to that, I think we saw a trend of policies that was sort of like government saying, well, just disclose all this information to us and we'll handle it. And I think, very quickly it sort of becomes obvious that it's really too much information and not all of it is actionable, because what you really want is something that you can, do something about. If you're not in a position to do anything about it, having it doesn't really help you.
Thank you. I'm an independent board member, and I try to make sense for companies how to deal with cybersecurity issues. And one thing I find interesting is you saying there's too much information out there on the cert side, but actually small and medium-sized companies lack information crucially. And so I was wondering, is there some concept of rolling out the CSERT information on a more local, regional scale? Are there some initiatives going on? Because I think it's exactly the opposite for the end user, and I'm scared to hear that we have such a big divide. Thanks.
Pedro, would you like to address this, of the dissemination of information from the CSERT?
Sorry. The practices change from place to place, and I was indeed looking to the website of our national CERT, and we publish vulnerabilities of systems. An end user or a company may apply to receive alerts from specific operating systems or applications, database, machines, and so on. So we publish vulnerabilities. The main problem is that SMEs, specifically SMEs, in big companies, they are more or less aware. They are not fully aware. Sometimes the CEO prefers to invest money in advertising the company and the products instead of investing in security, and that does not understand that after 2 years he may have a major data breach or a major failure of some computer platform or some internal data breach, because the inside threat is very significant. But in SMEs it's a problem, because in the economy of our country, as in many other places, SMEs are very crucial. It's extremely difficult to make them aware that the digital transformation is requesting from them looking to a different dimension of challenges. For example, when we had WannaCry, even some 2 very big ISPs had major problems. Some SMEs had their services on the cloud, and they have been with major disruptions for almost 1 month. So it's challenging. In our national CSERT, we try, and we have agreements with Cisco, with Microsoft, and other big vendors, and we redistribute some of the vulnerabilities on an automated basis to our user base. But it's a difficult problem. There is always something more that has to be done, because we don't have a vision of all the needs of our society. We do a lot of training activities. Outreach activities are a very big challenge. Just a small item in my notes. January this year, we made an event on ransomware, because we were seeing ransomware increasing very quickly. And when WannaCry came on the 12th of May, some big companies were prepared, the other ones were not prepared, because we try to pass the message. The media usually are not very favorable to these things. If there is a major crash, then the media come and they like to interview everybody. If you are sending warnings, it's very difficult. But we are here to try to do our best.
Does anyone else want to respond to that question?
Just short comment. Yeah, there's one more question. Just one short comment, that most of the incidents that affect SMEs, what the SMEs needed to do is basic cyber hygiene. Is really keep up with patches, use the latest versions of the software. So WannaCry, it didn't affect people that were up to date with patches. So because there were months since that. We did some awareness materials for SMEs for ransomware, because it's a big problem, and especially because you can still be affected by social engineering. So education is a big point. So in our case, we have a lot of awareness materials for end users. We have portals for that. And we prepare material for people to give classes, to use, and really we are preparing a lot of awareness materials for end users, and now starting some focused on SMEs. The first one was ransomware. So I think the point is really how to make them aware that they need to do some basic things. That's update and backup. So it's, I think it's really a communication problem more than anything else.
Right, and from the civil society side, I just wanted to add to that from the civil society perspective. Because Access Now CSIRT is interested in looking at the vulnerability disclosures that are disclosed by all certs and various other entities, and reinterpreting those or reassessing those specifically for their impact on members of civil societies. And we will look at how we can distribute that information as well. Another question?
You had a question?
Is that on? Is that better? Thanks. Sorry. Milton Mueller, Georgia Tech, Internet Governance Project. I'm concerned about the organizational model of CSIRTs and how they scale. So you were talking about the development of trust between civil society and these CERTs, and you were talking about sort of the way internet security used to be done, which was there were small groups of vetted communities who shared information freely with each other, and this whole model has been busted in the last, I don't know, 10 years because, number one, the linkage of national security to cybersecurity, so you get national certs that are not going to share information with their enemies, and you get more of a rule-based regulatory process, and it's not clear that the old model would scale anyway to the level that we need. So I mean, it's great that Access Now is starting a civil society CSIRT. I think, you know, one solution to this is to start new transnational, non-state-bound CSIRTs, but then there's just more and more CSIRTs, right? And how do we scale the problem of cooperating? This is what I was wondering about when I raised my hand a while back, but I thought maybe the question was too complicated, and we were running out of time, so I didn't ask until I was forced to.
Does someone want to have a go at answering that question?
I don't know if then, I know Adli is a moderator, but how to enhance trust is one of the major topics that it's in discussion within the CERT community, was a major topic during the 2 years of the Best Practice Forum of CSIRT here in IGF. It is a major topic of the Best Practice Forum on cybersecurity this year. But the thing is, really, information sharing, there's also some kind of myth that you are sharing like secret information, and usually you are sharing techniques, trends, and technical information. So the issue that we find it's lacking, and that maybe someone from academia could help, is really how to anonymize data. So what really is anonymized data? So most of the time, certain things that I think is anonymized enough, so they prefer not to share. And usually because we are trying to protect privacy and protect data. So there are some technical issues that are not necessarily because a CERT is some like intelligence or national areas that actually happens, but sometimes it's just because CERTs are overcautious and they don't want to share too much information. So this happens with us, a CERT PR. We have some data that we would like to share, even for research, but we say we don't know how to safely anonymize in an automated way. So at the end, we share results and statistics, but we don't share the actual data. And I know that this is, a lot of people say CERTs need to be more transparent with the data, and they have data that they share. But then usually it's because we are trying to protect users. So it's hard. It's not an easy question, but it's a question that is key to build trust and share.
Yeah, you certainly raise a really interesting problem because I do think the model has to change. I mean, particularly if we want, as you suggest, to have independent CSERTs that with a broad scope across the world. Just look at the funding of those. Funding is a really tough problem. As you know, being involved in a worldwide civil society CSERT, funding is a constant issue for us because funding comes with assumptions about where that money is coming from and therefore whether it's the operation is compromised or not, but also just getting enough to, you know, to adequately staff the operation is a real challenge. So any ideas, come and see me afterwards. Okay, I think we're just about at time. We might have time for one more quick question if there is one.
If there are no other questions from the room. Okay. Thank you. This is Dr. Subhi Chaturvedi for the record. We've seen governments not really getting internet governance. They're often not on the right side of NetGov. How do you see CERTs informing cyber policy making? Because you've seen approaches to incidents where governments have looked at a punitive approach vis-a-vis incentivizing best practices and upscaling protection, vulnerability detection. Do you see more CERTs contributing into policy making actively?
You are looking to me, so I... Well, I am in this position for 18 months. I am a professor at university. I was the founder of the Portuguese chapter of the Internet Society, so I'm following the IGF since the very beginning. I'm following ICANN since 1998. So I have a set of values that I try to apply in my practice. But sometimes I am a bit concerned, especially looking to some places in the world, some countries where we used to use as a model of the democratic processes where there are checks and balances of the different areas, and things are changing very quickly. In my specific case, I'm trying to practice every day what I believe are the best practice of the democratic role of our CSERT and protect the society as a whole and the users. I had here some notes that are not directly related to your question, but in May 2016, ENISA and Europol, ENISA, the European Network Information Security, and Europol issued a statement on lawful criminal investigation that respects the 21st century data protection. Basically, Europol wanted weak encryption, and ENISA says that strong encryption is crucial for e-commerce, for e-government, and of course for the protection of human rights. I suppose after the 3 days of this event, we will be enriched with more ideas to apply to our practices. But the use of the UN Charter should be considered as a very relevant thing in our daily practice. But there are some challenges going in the world. Let's wait and see.
Okay, thank you. So that's all we have time for. So I'd just like to thank the panel, Christine, Mallory, Audrey, Pedro, and Grace. There was a lot of content in there for me, so I hope you got value out of it as well. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Сейчас обед 1,5 часа и 3 часа открытие официальное. Там дальше мы идем в большой зал с 3 часов, там до вечера. Потому что больше ничего нет. Там, а вечером еще и какой-то прием. Есть, конечно, поездки. Я так понимаю, статское правительство, да, устраивает? Тут сразу написано все, кантон и сам город. Да, да, скоро правда. Да, что-то как-то. Я съел
Что, так лук съели, что ли? Там было таблеток.
Пойдем покупать, если что. А вам получше, нет?
А вот в Карфуре есть аптека.
Да, да у нас там прям рядом есть. Даже ближе, прям на углу.
Мне вчера что-то вечером захотелось есть. Я пошел в этот Карфур.
Да.
А он закрыт.